Hello everyone, Darren here from Knutson again, and today we're going to talk about the main control parameters using your Echo Control client application. So to access the main controls for your Echo Sounder, you have a couple of different options here. One, along the top title bar, you can click on Controls and Depth Channels, and you'll see that it'll come up and it'll be docked on the left-hand side of your screen. Another option to bring it up is just a quick button here where it just says CH. So once you bring this window up, you'll notice, in this case I'm running a dual channel Echo Sounder, 200 kilohertz and 28, and you can see that each one of these channels has a tab. So right now my channel 1 tab is to the forefront and I have control of all of these parameters. If I want to make a change to my channel 2, I'll have to toggle over to the second tab and make a change to those parameters. So this is just something to keep in mind when you're operating your Echo Sounder, to make sure that you actually have the proper tab open and to the forefront that you're going to be actually changing. So first off, we have our transmit off button. So by clicking this button, we're going to start the transmit pinging sequence and the receiving sequence of the Echo Sounder. But before we get to that, I want to go through a couple of other settings first. Your first one is your TX pulse. So typically you have, with the Sounder series, an option to go anywhere from a 16th of a millisecond pulse all the way up to a 4 millisecond pulse. With some of the scientific sounders, this will actually increase a little bit more and you'll see it go up as high as a 64 millisecond. But for this particular application, it's anywhere between a 16th of a millisecond and 4 milliseconds. So typically a good rule of thumb is you think is shorter pulse lengths in shallow water, longer pulse lengths in deeper water. You may get into an application where you may want to go with a slightly longer pulse length if there is some sub-bottom that you want to actually have a look at, or if you get into an area where you're doing, let's say, a post-dredge survey and there's a lot of sediment built up in the water column, you might want to go to a slightly longer pulse length just to give you a stronger signal in the water. Your TX power is next. There is 4 TX power settings that you have an option for. So typically with most of the Sounder series systems, you can get up to 1,000 watts of output power per channel, depending on the transducer, of course. The 4 power settings are kind of broken up into quarters. It's not quite 250 watts, 500, 750, and 1,000, but it's pretty close. Again, for the majority of surveys in 100 meters or less, you're probably not going to have to go over maybe a power level of 1 or 2. The next one I want to talk about here is your gain mode. So as a user, you have the option of running in an auto gain mode and a manual gain mode. Now, for most of the people that are doing a bottom tracking survey, just a typical bathymetric survey, we recommend using auto gain mode. That allows the system to control the amount of gain that's being applied on a ping-to-ping basis. So the Echo Sounder will look at the strength of the signal coming in and it will adjust the gain accordingly for processing. You'll see underneath here, the area that's grayed out actually tells you how much gain is being applied at a certain point in time. Now, we have a range of 0 to 96 dB of gain, and typically you want to have it running 40 dB or less to get a good processing. So if you're running an auto, it's going to pick it, it's going to reduce it down or increase it accordingly. There is an option if you'd want to go into manual mode, and that may be an area, again, if you're looking at bringing out some more detail of a sub-bottom. You can manually toggle it into manual mode, and then you can use a slide bar and adjust your gain accordingly. The next option you see here is TVG mode. Now that is a time varied gain mode. Now this is set up more for the scientific type of market. So what we recommend for anybody, again, doing a bathymetric type of survey, you can just leave this to off or set to none. If you get into much deeper water, you may be able to go into TVG mode, or if you're actually looking at, once again, more of a sub-bottom type of thing, you can turn on your bottom reference mode in TVG and it'll actually give you a chance to gain more signal out of the bottom. Your process shift, this is a digital gain that gets added in. So let's just jump back up here to our auto gain mode for a second. So you can see here, if you had a very weak signal that was coming in and your auto gain was ramping up quite high into the 70s, 80s, 90 dB level, what's going to happen is you're going to see a lot of the background noise start to get amplified as well. It turns out to be a very noisy looking echogram, and you could make it think that you were actually bringing noise in, where you're just amplifying the background noise because the amount of applied gain has been increased so much. If you get into a situation like that, what we would suggest is you do an increase of the processing shift, and that's just an added digital gain for the digital signal processing. So let me just show you an example here. So right now I have a test signal coming in. It's a very weak signal, so you can see here the amount of actual applied gain is in the 80s. So if we were out in the real world, you would probably have a lot more background noise on your echogram. But I just want to show you here, by doing a slight increase to your process shift, you can see how the amount of applied gain has dropped down. So that's going to once again reduce your background noise, get you a much cleaner signal. So this is just something to keep in mind if you're in an area where you've got a very weak bottom or a very weak return. Don't be afraid to increase your processing shift to a 1 or 2 and actually see the result come back on the amount of your applied gain. The sensitivity control. Where this comes into play is if you might get into an area where you can see on your echogram a very dark bottom and you can see a slight gray layer on top of it, a very, very, very light layer. Typically, even with a 200 kilohertz signal, you might be transmitting down through and digitizing on the harder bottom. If your application is that you want to actually digitize along the top of that very, very soft fluff layer, let's say, you can increase your sensitivity. What that'll do is it'll allow the echo sounder to digitize on a normal return that's much weaker that normally wouldn't worry about. Please keep in mind, when you're increasing this sensitivity though, you're increasing the sensitivity of the entire water column. So other stuff that might be floating within the water column can now possibly come up as a potential target. So sensitivity will allow you to digitize on a softer layer that you normally would penetrate through, but could also bring up multiple targets inside the water column. Your draft, that's fairly straightforward. You can either set it here. In some cases, you may be able to set your draft in if you're running a different type of data logging software package. You can set your draft in there. TX blanking. So where this comes into play, on a normal transducer, you'll get a nice dark line at the top. You'll get a transmit ringing, reverberation. I've heard it called many different things. But that ringing at the top can actually trigger as a false echo. So what we want to do is we want to blank that out. So let's say, for example, you were running a survey and you could see you had maybe half a meter worth of this thick black line at the top of your screen. You'd want to set your TX blanking to a meter, something a little bit deeper. And basically, you're telling the system, hey, let's not worry about anything between 0 and, in this case, 2.5 meters, because it may be something that's going to false trigger and it's going to throw us off. Now, please keep in mind that if you get that set too deep and you go back to work in shallower water, you're going to tell the system not to worry about digitizing your real return. Once again, if we happen to be going back to our 5-meter test pulse we have coming across here, and let's say somebody had set the blanking to 7 meters. So at this point here, you can see I'm still getting an echogram coming across, but my digitizer is very confused because it can find a bottom in my search window, but I'm telling it to ignore anything between 0 and 7 meters. So have it set deep enough that it's going to ignore any kind of feedback you're getting from your transducer ringing, but don't set it too deep that it could affect your returns when you get into shallower water work. The primary channel right now is selected for 200 kilohertz. I'm going to get into more an explanation of this once we get into the next video, which is talking about range and phase. Link all controls. If this is active, what it'll do is it'll make sure that both channels are operating at the same. So if you make a change to one channel and you go to the next channel, it'll also be changed to that same parameter setting. This comes into play if you're working with side scan, where you want to actually get your port and starboard to both work at the same parameters. And global TX, by clicking this, you will actually activate both channels at once. And it just gives you the option of control of both channels, similar to your link all controls. So that's our basic menu controls parameters for your Echo Sounder, working with the Echo Control client. And as I mentioned earlier, the next video we'll be talking about will be your range and phase. Thank you.